And as we are just waiting a few minutes for a few more people to join us, I'll just let you know that this is positive behavior support and behavior intervention plans with David here, who will be presenting today. It's all yours, David.
Okay, sounds great. So just to give you a brief background of me, I'm a retired special educator. My last couple of jobs, I was the director of special education in two different school districts. I also worked as a teacher for students with emotional disturbances and acted as a coordinator. And I have pretty extensive training in positive behavior support and applied behavior analysis. And I acted as a consultant in those fields for several years. I also taught at California State University Northridge for several years, teaching special education classes. And last but not least, I have a lovely, soon-to-be 16-year-old granddaughter with high functioning autism I'm very close with and have worked with closely over the years. And so that's it. That's about it for me. So we empower families of children with special needs to successfully understand and access the systems that serve them. We want you to become successful advocates and role models for your children. So being educated and informed is one of those skills and strategies toward becoming the best advocate you could be. But just keep in mind that we're not attorneys and we're not advocates. We're here to help you develop your advocacy skills and to help strategize pre and post IEPs, problem solve with schools and so on. So that's a description of who we are at Matrix. So we want to provide you with a basic understanding of PBS theory. And so PBS, positive behavior support, is the foundation of behavior intervention plans. So when you have a behavior intervention plan for your student, that is based on the philosophy and the theory of positive behavior support. So to understand the theory is really important in being able to understand what a positive behavior, what a behavior intervention plan is. So behavior intervention plans are written roadmaps, again, that use PBS theory to identify problem behaviors, specify ways to decrease them, and encourage new socially acceptable behaviors. So to truly understand BIPs, you really do need to understand what positive behavior support is. This is just going to read this. This is a description that I like that I got from the Association for Positive Behavior Support. So a formal definition for positive behavior support, PBS, is a set of research-based strategies used to increase quality of life and decrease problem behaviors by teaching new skills and making changes in a person's environment. Okay, so that's a pretty good description of what positive behavior support is. So problem behaviors don't occur in a vacuum. There's almost always a legitimate reason. So children with disabilities don't display problem behaviors just to ruin your day or your teacher's day. That's not what they're about. There's nothing vindictive in the underlying need. So while the actual behavior can range from annoying to even dangerous, it's important to keep in mind that the child is expressing a legitimate need and they're not just acting out just because. Behaviors are communication. A child is letting people in their environment know that they have a need and are communicating the need as best they can. So when we really start to realize that behaviors are not a willful act of defiance, that they're a way for a child without other tools to communicate, we can start to look at behaviors from a much more objective viewpoint. The purpose of what we want to do is to take the power struggle out of behavior. Okay. So once a reason is given, replacement behavior taught how to get met. So we have to define the function of the behavior in order to select an appropriate replacement behavior. If we mistake or misidentify why the behavior is occurring, the replacement behavior won't meet the underlying need and the behavior plan won't work. So it's critical that we get the function of the behavior correct because we need to teach a socially acceptable behavior that replaces that same need. So the replacement behavior includes ways for a child to communicate needs more appropriately. So communication is the key. Once we understand this, the behavior again starts to lose power over both the student and the adults working with the student. Okay, so continuing with that, then the next part of it is that the environment is modified to reduce or eliminate triggers that lead to the behavior. So PBS emphasizes modifying the behavior that problematic behaviors occur in, so that we take away the opportunity to display the problematic behavior, and that opportunity is minimized as much as possible. Eventually, the student can be taught to control their own environment, and that's really the key with this, is that eventually children take control of their own environment, they take control of their behaviors, and because they understand where they're coming from. Coping strategies and skills are taught to empower the child to reduce the need for the behavior. So teaching coping strategies such as stress management techniques helps our students learn how to self-manage, and that can be used throughout their life. And it's one of the most valuable life skills that we can teach our children. Okay, next. So some behaviors are neurologically based and may not respond to teaching replacement behaviors. However, teaching and reinforcing coping strategies along with environmental modifications can be very effective. So we need to understand that there are some behaviors that are just not going to respond to the teaching of replacement behaviors. These are neurologically based, usually. So these are intransigent behaviors, such as Prader-Willi syndrome. That's where a child has a genetic disorder that doesn't allow them to feel sated or full from food. And so they're constantly looking for food and eating anything that is within their reach. So that's a genetic disorder. We cannot change that. Sometimes bipolar disorder would be another disorder that can't be taught when a child is in a particular state, either depressive state or a manic state. So what we need to do in those cases is help the person cope with their environments by teaching coping skills and then again changing the environment. Punishment does not work. While punishment may succeed for a short time, in the long run, it is ineffective in eliminating problem behaviors. And this is because punishment does nothing to address the underlying need. So not only does it not work, actually what one does by using punishment is reinforcing the very behavior that we're trying to extinguish. Frankly, punishment, and unfortunately in my career, I saw it at times in classrooms, punishment can feel good to the punisher, and it may actually work at the moment. It may actually extinguish that behavior for a short period of time. But our ultimate goal is for the student to be successful, independent adults who can advocate for themselves instead of relying on others to control their actions, which is exactly what punishment is. It's a controlling of another person's actions. Okay, next. Okay, so that's a little tiny introduction to positive behavior support. And now we're going to talk about what behavior intervention plans include. So the first thing is that it includes an accurate description of the behavior. So we need, again, and I mentioned this, so we need to accurately identify the behavior and analyze its function. An accurate description will lead to correctly identifying the replacement behavior. So we're going to get into more about identifying behaviors and what the replacement behaviors look like, but it's very important that those be described as accurately as possible. So we also need to identify a pro-social replacement behavior. And that usually is anything that would be age and grade appropriate for a child. So, you know, a child not raising his hand or their hand in class, the replacement behavior for that would be that they raise their hand in class. And we'll talk more about how we get there. So it's anything that looks like other kids would look in the classroom is what that pro-social behavior would usually look like. And then we need a plan to encourage, reinforce the replacement behavior. Excuse me, reinforcement is the most complicated part of positive behavior support and behavior intervention plans, just because it becomes relatively theoretical. And I'm going to give you descriptions or definitions of both positive and negative reinforcers, but do not get hung up on them. They can get very confusing, and you'll see as we're going through the presentation that it becomes clear as to what these will look like. So don't sweat it if this seems confusing, but we do need to get into the weeds for just a minute. So a positive reinforcer is anything positive or given to a person to encourage a behavior. So a positive reinforcer can be either something that we would consider, most people would consider to be good, or it could be something that we would consider to be bad. So let's again use the example of the child who doesn't raise their hand in class. So if that child is being punished for not raising their hand in class, and the teacher says, Johnny, go to the office, and Johnny has a chance to spend 10 minutes with the principal, that's a positive reinforcer because he's getting the attention that he wants at that time. So you have to understand that positive reinforcement can be either something good or something bad in kind of the classic sense of the term. Now, negative reinforcement becomes even more complicated, and be sure not to sweat it. Okay, so basically, what negative reinforcement is that something is taken away to encourage a behavior. So a really quick example of that would be a child who, and this will be one of the examples we use later on in the presentation, that a child has a really hard time completing worksheets in class on their own. And so if we take away that requirement for completing worksheets, that is a negative reinforcer, but it also encourages a behavior. Okay, so, I wanted to make those definitions to you, but please don't get confused by them because they can be quite confusing. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so behavior intervention plans also include instructions on how to ignore or minimize the old problem behavior. So the old behavior is not going to go away permanently overnight. It's going to pop up with some regularity before eventually going away or becoming much less of a problem. So we need a plan what to do when the old behavior comes back. We have to analyze what's going to work, experiment with that, and then respond to the old behavior when it comes up. And then we also have to look at how the environment will be modified and what coping skills will be taught. So as I mentioned before, a very important part of PBS is the recognition that some behaviors may not respond to interventions without significantly modifying the environment in which they occur. The IEP team needs to specify what changes will be made so as not to encourage the old behavior while encouraging new behavior or teaching coping skills. Okay. So there's different levels of support that we can provide in doing behavior intervention plans and behavior goals. And so the level of the support depends on the seriousness, the duration, and the intensity of the behavior. The IP team needs to decide how serious a behavior is. They also have to identify how easy or difficult it is to define the function of the behavior. So at that point, then they can decide on what the level of intervention should be. So the intervention should reflect how interfering the behavior is to a child's ability to access their education and successfully interact with their environment. It's important that we respond proportionally to behaviors. We don't want to have, and we'll talk about this in a minute, a full-blown functional behavior analysis and a behavior plan and a goal and put all these resources in if the behavior can be handled with a lower level of intervention. It's the lowest level that we can provide is always the best because it interferes less with the child's ability to function independently. Okay, next one. So the first level are goals only. Goals are adequate to address a behavior that is minimally interfering and the purpose is well understood. So there are times when a goal is enough. The goal, if a student knows what it is, the staff knows what the goal is, it can be just maybe a matter of simple reinforcing the new behavior and reminding when the old behavior occurs. And so if that goal is formalized in an IEP, that may be enough for the child to be able to make the change that they need to make. The second level is if the goal is not enough, is that we have to look at a goal and a behavior intervention plan. And this is adequate when the interfering behaviors, for more interfering behaviors, where the purpose of the behavior is clear. So when a behavior's purpose is obvious or discoverable by just using informal means, there's a need for more than a goal. And we can add a behavior intervention plan in that case. So the behavior plan, it provides a roadmap of interventions. Also the reinforcements, the environmental modifications that help a student use appropriate behaviors. So it's a more formal, more complete guide to how we're going to handle the interfering behaviors, the problem behaviors for the child. Okay. And the highest level that we look at would be a goal, a functional behavior analysis, and a behavior intervention plan. This is for serious behaviors that require a data-driven analysis. So FBAs are appropriate for those behaviors that are complex, very interfering, and whose purpose is not clearly evident. There's times, and you're going to see it when we look at examples of students in a little while, it can be really tough to figure out why a behavior is occurring. Or we may have a good idea of what the purpose is, but we need to analyze ways that effectively reinforce the replacement behavior, or we need to do a more thorough study on what environmental changes are needed. And this is when a formal analysis is needed, and that ensures that we have the best chance for a behavior to change. A well-researched FBA can inform an IEP team so that there's a higher level of certainty of the factors contributing to a problem behavior. Okay, so a goal or BIP is only a piece of paper. It is not fully implemented. Each component of a BIP must be implemented exactly as it is written if it is to be successful. So in my own experience in visiting hundreds of classrooms and observing hundreds of students and the implementation of behavior plans over the years, behavior plans often don't get implemented the way they're supposed to be implemented. When I say implemented, I mean exactly as they're written, because what we're doing is we're taking data on the implementation of the plan to determine how effective it is. And if we're changing even little things in the behavior plan, and that's going to skew our data, and it makes the data be essentially useless in terms of being able to inform the IEP team of what kind of changes that we need. So there's a variety of reasons for the lack of implementation of plans. The biggest one, I think, is a lack of training. A lot of times teachers don't understand what positive behavior support is. They don't understand the importance of behavior intervention plans. I also, unfortunately, see the lack of will on the part of teachers and staff, the lack of commitment to implement a plan. I have to say that implementing a positive behavior support plan exactly as it's written and doing it with full effort, it's very hard work. It's much easier to send a child to the office or to punish a child or to do pretty much anything else than implement a behavior plan. It is not easy, but that's what we're in this business for, and that's what educators need to do. So also what happens is that the old problematic behavior doesn't go away in a predictable straight line. And we're going to talk about this more in the future. And it becomes very discouraging for staff when they see that maybe a behavior plan is working for a while, and then all of a sudden it stops working and nobody knows why. And then staff and everyone starts to doubt how good the behavior plan is. So as a parent, you need to make sure, you need to be aware that this is a problem in schools many times, and that we have to be watchful and ask questions about the implementation of the behavior plan, observe in the classroom if that's possible. But it's one of those areas that you need to pay attention to. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at behavior intervention plans in a little more detail. So we've talked about the theory, and so let's talk about what they can actually look at. So what we're going to do is that we're going to look at 5 different students and how positive behavior support and behavior intervention plans can help each of them in real world problem behaviors. One thing I want to make clear at the beginning of this, and just from what you all have shared, it's obvious that we're using very simplified cases here. Almost all behavior cases are much more complicated than this, but it will give you a sense of how we look at intervening with particular cases. It's not so much realistic, but it's going to be hopefully be helpful to you. Okay, so first of all, it's important that we describe exactly what a behavior looks like, and let's go on to the next one with the present level. Okay, this is Marie, which is one of the students that we're going to use as an example, and this is a present level for her. And I just, don't worry about the details of this, but I want you to see is that how specific we need to be in identifying what the problem behavior is. What does it look like? Is the kind of the credo that I always went by. If I would want to walk into a classroom and not even know who the student was that I was observing, and be able to identify the student based exactly or specifically only on what the behavior is, if it had been defined clearly enough. So I'm just going to read this present level. So when asked to work independently on worksheets in the classroom, fourth grader Marie will refuse the request 75% of the time and will instead act out, which consists of one or more of the following actions: throwing with no target, or breaking her pencil, dropping the worksheet on the floor, crying, or using a loud voice to indicate refusal. Marie has the ability and motivation to use a behavior plan and classroom supports to learn how to get her needs met. So that's pretty specific. I could walk in the classroom and not know who Marie was, and she would be given a worksheet and she would tear it up or break her pencil 75% of the time, or she'd do one of those things. I would know who she was. That's a very specific description of the behavior that would give us a sense of what that behavior is. So again, it's that term that I use, what does it look like? And it has to be very specific. Okay, so analyzing the reasons for the behavior. So depending on who you talk to and what websites you visit and what information or behaviors you talk to, these reasons for behavior may change slightly, the wording may change, but these are the most commonly used ones in the field of behavior. So they're attention, escape, sensory issues, tangibles, which is getting something, a physical thing, and then power and control. And the last one, power and control, is included a lot of times. I really like it when I was doing behavior plans and acting as a behaviorist. Power and control was one that often was overlooked, but it's one that is can be very important. It's also one that can be mixed up with other things really easily. So again, the reason for correctly analyzing the behavior. Okay, so so many times it takes skill and experience to determine the reason for a behavior. It is vital to get the reason right, as the replacement behavior must fulfill the same needs. And as Emily was mentioning, this is the most important part of positive behavior support, getting the function of the behavior correct. If we don't get it correct, there's very little chance that the behavior plan is going to succeed, because you're just addressing the wrong thing. Again, part of this is to clearly describe what that behavior is so we can see a physical manifestation of it. All right, so let's look at attention. A child who needs attention will seek a demand response. So remember, we talked about this previously, about anything that encourages a behavior is a positive reinforcement. And anything you take away, I put it in a little different terms here, but the same thing. Anything that discourages behavior is negative reinforcement. So if you take something away, that, and anyway, let's not get in the weeds with that, but just remember that positive reinforcement or that negative reinforcement can be something good or it can be something bad. But as long as it's fulfilling the underlying need, that child is going to be attracted to that way of getting their needs met. So punishments reinforce it because the need is more important than the response. So if the need is attention and the response provides attention, Johnny, go to the office, you're a bad boy, whatever it might be, that's a positive reinforcer. It doesn't matter that most people would find the punishment unpleasant. The child needing attention will actively seek it out in the absence of attention. So here's our another student. This is second grader Robert. Constantly talks out of turn in class. He has ADHD and has a difficulty regulating his verbal outbursts. His teacher has sent him to the office numerous times, but he won't stop. In fact, the more he is punished, the more he talks out. So, an obvious example of Robert getting a need met for attention by being reinforced for doing what he's doing. Okay, so let's look at escape. So escape is the need to get out of doing something, a task or a situation. Again, escape is more important than what happens to the child as a result. Escape is one that's often misidentified as a need for attention, and there's a really simple reason for that. And this is kind of anecdotal with my experience, but in other people that I respect in the field and have talked to, it seems like kind of a common thing. So the reason that escape gets mistaken for attention is that the person who's providing the response, the teacher, for instance, is gauging how much time and attention they need to provide to that child in order to deal with the behavior. So actually, it's their attention that they're mistaking instead of the need for escape from the child. Particularly in general education classes, I would see this all the time. A teacher would tell me I'm spending all my time dealing with this child. They obviously need attention, where the child actually just needs to get out of the classroom for a few minutes. So it's a common misunderstanding from staff at times. Okay. And this again is Marie, and this is our child that needs the escape at the present level that we talked about. So fourth grader Marie, who has high functioning autism. She is a student whose present level we read a few slides ago. And Marie becomes extremely anxious when I didn't finish that slide, I'm sorry. So in spite of being held in from recess, she continues to refuse to complete worksheets. So for Marie, anxiety is at the root of what's going on with her need to escape. She just has we talked about that lab beaker being full. Her beaker is really full. And when she's given that worksheet to work on, oftentimes it just overflows and goes over the top. And she just needs to get out of it no matter what it is. Okay, so let's look at next one, sensory issues. Sensory issues are often related to autism, not always the case, certainly, but it's most closely identified, I guess, with autism. So we look at tics or flapping or any of those kind of repetitive movements that children with autism frequently display. And those are getting sensory input as a self-regulation mechanism. That's usually what it's about. Sensory issues often are addressed through occupational therapy. We had that question before. Occupational therapy deals with how information is received by the brain and processed, and that how it comes out in physicality in the senses. So, touch, smell, and so on. And that's what the specialty of occupational therapy works on. Okay. So this is what we talked about with the other child that was hitting himself in the chest. And this is, I don't know if it's the same reason, but it's the example that we have for the child. So 11th grader Tony has low functioning autism. He strikes his head with a closed fist when he is frustrated. The hitting helps regulate the frustration. This most often occurs when he is trying to learn a new academic skill. I want to digress just for a minute to talk about self-harm, hitting oneself, those kind of things. 30 years ago, headbanging was the number one reason for injury and death of people with autism. When people were institutionalized 30 and 40 years ago, you would often go on those campuses and you would see everyone with autism wearing a helmet. And that was because the head banging was so prevalent. Things like PBS and applied behavior analysis and all of the research that has gone on in this field over the last 30 or 40 years has really helped reduce the incidence of self-harm for people with autism. And so that's it's a good reason to look at this and know that it works. Studies have shown that it clearly works, but seeing that progression of how we're getting better at this, I think it's helpful. And if you go on a school campus these days, I very rarely would see a child with a helmet anymore. It's almost always taken care of by applying behavior methodologies. Okay. And tangibles. So tangibles is the need to gain possession of an object, food, etc., that a child feels they must have. This kind of thing, it's not that common in areas outside of the neurological diseases like Prader-Willi. So it occurs really with two groups of students. The first is the Prader-Willi syndrome, which is that feeling of being full doesn't exist because there's a missing gene in the child's neurology. The other group of students that I've seen this a lot with are students that have what's called reactive attachment disorder. And not always, but these are usually children that have been abused, probably starved, oftentimes sexually abused. And they don't eat food or don't have that desire to eat food all the time, but what they do have the desire is to hoard food. So my best friend in education, saint she is, she adopted 4 children from the ages of 9 months to 5 years. This was about 17 or 18 years ago. And except for the 9-month-old, they all had serious reactive attachment disorder, and food hoarding was a terrible issue for them. So it took a lot of work to get over that, and that was a real issue for them. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So 6th grader April has Prader-Willi syndrome, in which one of the effects is an insatiable appetite, which is directly connected to a neurological abnormality. April will attempt to eat food whenever and wherever it is available. So for a student with Prader-Willi, it's important that food just be kept out of sight, that it be constantly regulated, and that's just what needs to be done. And again, for those students with reactive attachment disorder, their access to food must be consistently monitored as well. Okay. And the last one is power and control. So this is when a child needs to have a say, sometimes the exclusive say over their environment. This again is often misidentified. It's often misidentified as a need for attention or escape, but it's quite a different need. Children with disabilities have less control of their environments than typical children. They may have a greater need for power and control. So a student with a need for power control is going to act probably negatively if attention is given to them, because that attention is going to be perceived by them as someone trying to control them. Or if they're allowed to escape, that's not what the need is about. They don't need to go someplace. What they need to do is to be able to have that experience of where they are in control of the situation. And certainly in escape, if they're outside the classroom or a normal environment, that's not going to be helpful. All right, so the example of this one is 8th grader William has an intellectual disability. When accompanied by a classroom assistant to speech therapy sessions, he will elope by running onto the playground and refusing to go to the speech room. So elopement is a common behavior for students that need to exert power and control. Again, as I mentioned in the last slide, we can easily see how this can get confused for escape, but it's really a different need. So before we talked about the hierarchy of interventions. At the highest level, that functional behavior analysis, if you remember, along with the behavior intervention plan and goal, is needed if there's any confusion about the function of the behavior. And you can see just by going through particularly attention, escape, and power and control, that it's very easy to get these things confused and to get the behavior plan wrong, and then to have either the behavior escalate or just not get any better. All right, so replacement behaviors. So replacement behavior is simply what we want to see instead of the problem behavior. In a school setting, this would be behaviors that meet age and grade expectations for typical children to the greatest extent. Now, there's a lot of talk about this, and there's some controversy about this, and being called ableism and being discriminatory towards people with disabilities. I'm agnostic about that. I don't know. I mean, the people say that a child with autism has weird behaviors, then that's okay, because that's what their behavior, they're expressing themselves. I really don't have an opinion on that. I mean, I think it's up to the family to decide if the behaviors are so interfering that they're interfering with the child's life, or if they're simply odd behaviors that are okay because that's who the child is. So that is some part of a controversy that you may see. A great teacher that I worked with taught a class of moderate to severe students, and she had one child with Down syndrome, Jesse. And Jesse came into high school as very atypical, had a lot of interfering behaviors. And what Vicki, this teacher, she was the Los Angeles County Teacher of the Year one year, by the way. She was an outstanding teacher. She wanted her students to look cool. And she thought that the term cool equated with fitting in with other students on campus. And so with the example of Jesse with Down syndrome, by the time he was a junior, he was a motorcycle dude. He was wearing motorcycle jackets and had his hair in a 50s cut, and he would walk around campus like he owned the place. And it was cool. I thought that was that was great. But again, I'm not discounting the fact that, some of these behaviors and trying to change these things, that they're not interfering, could be a case of ableism. The other thing we need to recognize with replacement behaviors is that these aren't going to happen all at once. You're not going to have the child, Robert, raising his hand immediately and not have, some level of learning in this. It's just the way it is. So there's something that I call, that we're stay on that same slide, Margaret. So what there's something in the field of behavior called approximating success. And what that means is that a child is getting there. Their behaviors are starting to get a little better, and they're not where they should be or where they need to be, but they are better than they were. There's some improvement taking place. So in the case of Robert not raising his hand, he may get to the point where he raises his hand and talks out at the same time. So too often what I see is that a teacher following a behavior plan will say, no, Robert, that's not okay. You need to raise your hand before you talk out. Instead, under the idea of approximating success, that idea of him raising his hand and talking out at the same time is a time to celebrate. That's a time to heavily reinforce Robert, because he needs to really deep down, physically and mentally, he needs to feel what that behavior is like. He needs to have that sense inside, this is what it's like. This is the way it's supposed to be. And once that feeling is there, once that recognition is there with a child, then you have a chance of getting some really permanent, consistent success. So getting there instead, and Margaret mentioned this to me, and Margaret, I hope you don't mind me sharing, but with your children, that you asked me what I thought of particular behavior plans, and you said, but they never got there. They were never able to get there. So they constantly had this goal out there that they were never able to meet. That's a clear example where the IEP team needs to take a couple of steps backwards and determine where the child is and what a reasonable place for them to be in a reasonable period of time is, and shoot for that, even though it's not full success. Again, my friend Vicky, the teacher, she would have a child that would elope. And what she would do is that as the child was running out of the classroom, she would say, I can't remember the child's name, please leave the classroom right now. And so what she was doing is that she was reinforcing the idea that, she would be able to control this behavior eventually. It's complicated in terms of what the actual theory behind that is, but it does work. So those kind of things, we're celebrating those, ability to be able to do little things and not the whole thing. Okay, so replacement behaviors continued, but new behaviors must be taught. Behaviors are just like any other skill that a child needs to learn. They need to have explicit, systematic instruction. If we know the reason for the behavior, many times a new behavior can be taught that meets the same need as the old inappropriate behavior, which we've talked about often already. And this is often overlooked. Teachers, particularly general education teachers who may not be expert in the behavior field, often forget that explicit instruction is needed for this, just like it is for language arts or math or any other discipline. They just don't happen on their own. Kids don't teach themselves how to behave. So the student needs to know exactly what's on their behavior plan, by the way. I'm a big proponent of even students that are have an intellectual disability or possibly lower functioning, know as much as they can exactly what's on the behavior plan, because they need to know what's happening. And if they're a partner in that plan, it takes away the power with this. I'll give you an example. When I was a teacher with kids with emotional disturbances, we used a point and level system. And I made sure that every child knew exactly what their program was, what their behavior plan was, exact expectations. And so what that did is that we both became captives, I guess you would say, of the behavior plan. I couldn't change the behavior plan. The child couldn't change the behavior plan. We were both subject to the provisions of the plan. So oftentimes at the end of the day, I'd have a child come up to me and say, Mr. Porchel, third period, I didn't get this mark on my point sheet when I should have, because you did this or I did this, and that wasn't what was on the behavior plan. And at that point, I knew that we were getting success because that child had bought into it. They were monitoring themselves. They were monitoring me. because I was just as responsible for that plan as they are. And we were both subject to the provisions of it. So that's a really important point to make. Okay. And again, we talked about that some behaviors are physiologically or neurologically hardwired. And we need to keep in mind what was discussed previously about coping strategies and environmental modifications. I'll have to say that in the field of behavior, some people make the mistake that medical professionals often make, where they think that everything can be cured. They think that all they have to do is get the right intervention, get the right replacement behavior, have the right plan, and they can, darn it, get that replacement behavior taught. But sometimes we have to recognize that there is no cure. For April with Prader-Willi syndrome, she is not going to be cured from having that missing gene. That's not going to happen. So we need to recognize the fact that we just have to minimize some behaviors as much as we can and teach coping strategies and skills to those kids. Okay. So let's talk about some examples. So remember, Robert was our student that doesn't raise his hand. So Robert learns that he can ask for time to talk to an available staff member outside of class when he needs attention. Okay. Marie learns that she can have a break if she uses stress reduction techniques that she has learned. So one of the things to keep in mind is, again, that environmental modification. In a perfect world, Robert wouldn't have a need for attention, but that's just not the case. So the replacement behavior needs to be a realistic response to where Robert is. I hear some teachers would tell me that, allowing Robert to go out and talk to a staff member or have an appointment with the principal or these things that give him attention in a positive way is unfair to other kids. But it's just not true, because those other kids don't have that same need for attention that Robert has. So eventually, all of these replacement behaviors are going to evolve so that students take more and more ownership of their needs. So eventually, what Robert's going to do when he's a 40-year-old in a meeting is that he's going to learn that, okay, I can hang in here for 5 minutes and not talk out. What I need to do is to take deep breaths. I need to use whatever strategies I have that have worked for me in the past. And so that's really the key, is teaching that independence to these children. Tony can learn. Tony is our student that hits himself. And so Tony can learn stress reduction skills he can use when feeling frustrated. However, Tony's environment will also need modification so that demands are balanced with the reality of his ability to handle stress. So Tony feels stressed when he's learning a new academic skill. That beaker we talked about being full is super full for Tony when that's getting learned. He has a very short fuse. So what we may do for a time, and again, I guess I have to mention that these are all steps that you take, and you go from the baby steps up to the big steps with these. And so at first, we may just remove Tony from the situation for 5 minutes before he has to start working on that. Or we may, when the teacher sees him, feeling stressed, we may ask him to go outside. We may do these things that may not seem to be particularly productive at the moment, but eventually we up the ante on these. We become more demanding as the child learns skills. We talked about that, I think, with April, with the worksheets that she has difficulty doing. So with April, we'll use that as an example of negative reinforcement, that we say, April, you don't have to do worksheets, but what you have to do is you have to practice your stress reduction techniques while the other kids are doing their worksheets. So work completion is the idea we want to get to eventually, but at first what we want to do is to get that underlying issue taken care of, which is the anxiety that she's feeling when she's asked to do worksheets. We don't go for her doing a partial worksheet at first, because that doesn't do anything to reduce her stress. She's still having that demand made on her, which she probably won't be able to deal with right at that moment. Okay, let's go on to the next one. April will never be able to control her need for food. She can learn ways to calm herself when she is feeling stressed, but her environment must be controlled to limit access, and she must have a predictable schedule for when food is available. So again, just not beating a dead horse, but recognize the need for teaching coping skills. about eventually learning to internalize those skills instead of having to be reminded from the outside, and then taking those and being able to use those skills when she needs them. And as she does that, she'll gain more and more control over her environment because she'll gain more and more control over herself. Okay. William is our student that elopes when he goes to speech therapy sometimes. So William learns he can attend speech therapy sessions as long as he can choose what activity he will participate. He is able to choose from a list of lessons. So note that the environment is not being changed so radically that William has all the control. What we're doing is giving him a chance to work within the system so that he has a say about what happens with him. But the demands are still in place. It's simply that he has choices in how he's going to do it. So William's going to still be responsible for the work to be done, but he has now some control over what that looks like. All right. So again, reinforcement, and let me just read. I really like this definition. I just picked this up recently. Excuse me. So positive reinforcement refers to the introduction of a desirable or pleasant stimulus after a behavior. The desirable stimulus reinforces the behavior, making it more likely that the behavior will reoccur. And that's from positive psychology from last year. One thing I got to bring up at this point is the idea of bribery. And probably when I was a coordinator in a large district in Southern California, I attended, I estimated it was well over 2,000 IEP meetings. And general ed teachers, when there was a behavior plan, the most common feedback I got in a behavior plan is that you're bribing the child. It's really a common misconception. So, if you look at reinforcement as we all want reinforcement. If we work, we expect to be fairly compensated. If we volunteer for a charity, we want some level of recognition or internal satisfaction of having volunteered. This is not mercenary. This is a fact of our existence that we need something to give us the idea that what we're doing has some value. So reinforcement is a similar bargain. So what we're doing in a behavior plan, the most important part of that is that we set up a situation where there is a clear and consistent payoff for clearly identified behaviors. And let me give an example from my own life. I was working with my granddaughter. This was, 8 or 9 years ago, I guess. And she was going through a very, very difficult time at that point. She had ABA in the home, and there was a very good behavior plan set up, and it was great reinforcement. She had a visual schedule. Everything was put in place. Her dad was the main implementer of that. He was really good at it. But I was observing one day, and he asked her to take out the garbage, which was the thing that she didn't like to do. It was a really undesirable activity for her. But this time, he took the bag out of the trash can, took it out to the outside to the big trash can, closed the lid, which he never did, came back, put the bag in. And at the end of that, her dad said, "Sweetie, you did so well. I'm going to give you 5 more minutes on that reinforcer you normally get this time," which is a game on a computer time. That was bribery. So what my son-in-law did was that he took what was a bargain between them, the behavior plan, where she got a certain number of minutes for performing the activity. And he went outside that plan and gave something extra, which totally shifted the power that was in that relationship. He being able to automatically or just on the fly change the behavior plan made it that he had more power than my granddaughter did. So bribery can exist in these, but only under those circumstances where someone goes outside the parameters of the behavior plan. Again, you need to follow these very specifically. Okay. So when Robert asks for time with a staff member, his teacher provides him with explicit praise. When Marie uses stress reduction goals, she is given 10 minutes of time on a favorite game on her phone. So again, I just mentioned the reinforcement needs to be clearly identified and consistently applied. So with Marie, with Robert, we talked about the fact that his seeking attention in an appropriate way is a time to celebrate, even though he's not sitting in class and raising his hand like the other kids. He's getting there. He's approximating success. So we need to celebrate that step on his journey. For Marie, we talked about the fact that just practicing her stress reduction techniques is enough at the beginning, and that the reinforcement for that is not to have to work on a worksheet, but she's given 10 minutes of time on a computer game, because that's what reinforces her. Tony, which is our student that hits himself. Tony really likes cars. He is allowed 10 minutes of internet time to look at pictures of cars when he uses his stress reduction skills. Note that the reinforcement is not for work completion. And we've talked about that several times already. Okay, so we talked about that. Okay, so if we're providing, just a little bit more on that slide, if we're providing reinforcement for work completion for Marie or for Tony, that's not the point. They're going to get just as stressed. We have to look at, again, what that underlying need is. Okay, sorry about that. So for April, organizing the classroom school supply shelves is highly motivating. She is allowed to spend 10 minutes organizing them when she uses her stress reduction skills when feeling stressed. So whenever possible, if we can use a reinforcer that actually is not just socially acceptable, but actually helpful, that's a double win. So if we can have students do something that's of value intrinsically, that is good for everybody. So as much as we can make these things embedded in a functional, real way in a child's behavior plan, it makes it that much better. William is highly motivated by being able to walk around the school campus on his own. This is our student that elopes going to speech room. When he has successfully completed a speech, he is asked to deliver a message to the school office manager and then walk back to his classroom independently. So the reason I added that he doesn't just go to the speech room and then is allowed to walk independently back to class is that going to the office, even if it's a speech therapist, gives him a blank piece of paper folded up and say, this is a note for the school secretary, please deliver this for me. That's going to be more motivating for William than just walking back to the classroom. So if we can add a little bit extra, he's going to become more highly motivated to be able to have that greater level of independence. Plus, what we're doing is we're teaching a greater level of independence by just the fact that he's having to go more than one place. So, the more independence, the better. That's what our goal is for the lives of these children. All right, so ignoring or minimizing the old behaviors. It's important to not to encourage or reinforce the old behavior. Once again, the consequence is not as important as getting the underlying need met. We want to recognize and encourage the old behavior, not the new. So in with the new, out with the old. So we just don't want to unintentionally reinforce that behavior by concentrating on it. So some examples is when Robert talks out in class, his teacher recognizes another student for raising their hands before speaking. If Robert continues to talk out, his teacher will quietly ask him to go outside to talk to a classroom aide. I have to say that responding to the old behavior coming up is probably the most complicated thing in doing one of these presentations, because there are so many ways of not responding to an old behavior that is as unique as the child themselves that we're dealing with. So there's literally endless ways and techniques we can minimize or ignore these old behaviors. This is more of an art than it is a science. So this is one of those things that has to be explicitly noted in the IEP, but it may be the thing that's changed along with the enforcement schedule more often than anything else on a behavior plan, because we may not know what works going in. We may have to experiment a little bit on that, and there's a way of doing without breaking the behavior plan, which we won't go into. But that's an important thing to know, that this is tough, especially if these behaviors are highly interfering. A child hitting themselves or hitting somebody else or pulling hair, those are pretty interfering behaviors. And so ignoring those, we're looking more at minimizing, obviously, than ignoring, and doing that in a way that's not coercive and not reinforce the old behaviors is sometimes a very difficult thing to do. Okay. So a few more just very simple examples. When Marie reverses throwing a pencil, her teacher does not respond. Marie is allowed to sit quietly for the time other students are working. Okay, again, this is just one of many thousands of examples we could give for this. Okay, If Marie's continues to behavior escalates to interfering with other students, the teacher quietly asks Marie to take a break in a predetermined area of the classroom. This needs to be planned in advance. And this is another one of those examples where the teacher and the student need to be on the same page about what is in the behavior plan. Because if you tell Marie to go to the back of the classroom and she doesn't have any idea of what exactly that means. Does that mean I stand there or sit in a corner, or what do I do? Those things need to be talked about in advance. So you sit down with Marie in describing the behavior plan and say, Marie, when you're acting this way, this is what our agreement is going to be. I'm going to give you some kind of a prompt to go to this particular area. You know exactly where to go. You know exactly what you can do when you're there, so that there's no confusion about it. Because one thing we have to recognize is that, well, I used to do crisis prevention training and safe restraints and all that sort of thing. An example I always used of someone who's in a mildly escalated state is using the example of someone cutting you off on the freeway with their car. And you ever notice how your mind kind of goes blank at that time, and the processing of information becomes much more challenging? That's what happens to our kids that are feeling stress and displaying these behaviors a lot of times. They're not going to listen to you if you sit down and have a conversation with them. There needs to be something in place that recognizes the fact that their car just got cut off and that they're not thinking clearly. So this all needs to be explicitly stated. All right. When Tony reverts to hitting himself, his teacher will remind Tony to use his stress reduction techniques to calm himself. So I mentioned this 2 or 3 times already. Now I won't beat it on again, but it's time for Tony to relax, not complete work. As his stress reduction skills become greater, his work production will increase. One goes with the other. Okay. If Tony is unable to stop hitting himself, his teacher asks Tony to take a break outside the classroom. Tony knows that he will not be required to start work again until he's ready. And this is important. Our goal is not for these children to become perfect, compliant children. It's for them to be able to learn skills to make them independent in life. So if Tony goes outside, but he knows that he's going to be subject to the same stress that he's escaping right now, that he's getting out of right now, it's not going to work, because he's going to say, oh, geez, I have to go back there in 5 minutes. It's going to be the same issue. And it's the cycle won't be broken at that point. So again, he's got to be ready. He's on his own time. Okay. For April, ignoring food-seeking behavior is not an option. It is not something she can control. Adults in her life will need to use environmental modifications instead of ignoring strategies. One thing I want to mention at this point, and somebody mentioned this to me about her own child, Connor Willie, and she said often what would happen is that school or classroom staff would bring things like a cup of coffee into the classroom, which was a real trigger for her daughter. And so, her daughter got to the point where she could ask the staff, that's really bad for me to see that. Can you please remove it? And staff would say, no, it's my cup of coffee. That's my cup of coffee inside the classroom. And I have to admit that there are times when I have seen behavior like this on the part of school staff and not kind of getting the idea that they're there for the children, not the other way around, that we are their service. We are there to teach them and not for our own convenience. So just a little story that bugs me sometimes. Okay. So when William reverts to running away from speech lessons to the playground, he is allowed to stay there as long as he needs. The classroom observes him from a distance. He is not allowed to deliver a message to the office or walk back to class by himself. Okay, this brings up a point that I had no tolerance for when I was a special ed administrator, and that's being coercive towards children, any way coercive. So if we were to go tell William, you need to get back into the classroom or you're going to be punished, or God forbid, put a hands on William to get him back into the office or get him back into the classroom, those are absolutely unacceptable. Those are coercive. Coercion is never something that we should apply to our children. So what do we do in this case? Now, we wait them out. I had many cases in my classroom when I was working with children with emotional disturbances where a child would refuse to do something and simply put their head down, or they might tear up the classroom, or they might in some way disrupt the classroom to such an extent that you would think that they couldn't stay. What we did in those cases is that we took the other children out of the classroom, and as long as the child wasn't in danger of hurting themselves or anybody else, not property damage. Property damage is not something to put hands on a child for. We would leave, we would let that child de-escalate on their own. And the other kids would simply go to an alternative classroom, and we would have school, and some of or a couple of people would remain behind just to observe the student, would not interfere. So I'd have times when this would go on until 5 o'clock at night, several hours after school ended. But that's the only way to respond to some of these things. Again, using that example of being cut off in the car, this child is having a meltdown. They're not able to think logically. They're incapable of it. So what we have to do is allow that meltdown, as long as it's safe, to go on as it has to go on without putting hands on. And that's in a school setting. I can't, speak to home. That's more of a personal decision. But that's, as long as they're safe, that's my philosophy. Okay, behavior spikes. And we talked about this briefly. I will be back, the Terminator. So in many cases, after a brief honeymoon, the old behavior will come back, often intensely. This is the time to stick to the behavior intervention plan. It will get better. I'll have to say, this is the bane of any behavior plan. As a matter of fact, and there's been lots of research done, these are called either behavior spikes, or they're also called, I'm sorry, burst, something burst. And I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the term right now. But these are very common. In fact, they're almost predictable with most behavior plans. So as a matter of fact, if the reason for the behavior chosen was correct, the more likely it is that there'll be a behavior spike. So let me just tell you what happens is that there's usually a honeymoon period, and there'll be a time where the behavior plan is working great and everybody's thrilled that the behavior is getting better. And then all of a sudden the behavior comes roaring back more intensely often than the original behavior. So you're getting this big, this extinction burst was the name of the other. I was thinking, you got this big behavior spike. So a chart, the keeping data goes way up, higher than it was ever before the behavior plan started. And so at that point, what happens is that people start to lose faith in the behavior plans. And I have seen it countless times when a behavior plan is either tweaked or just ignored at this point. But this is the time when you need to bear down and to make sure that behavior plan is in place and is being followed exactly the way it's supposed to be followed. Again, a behavior spike is often determinative of a correct function for the behavior. So don't get discouraged, because what happens over time is that those spikes will become less and less intense. That chart will start going down in the other direction, will get lower and lower. And eventually what happens is that child will abandon the old behavior completely, or it will be minimized to such an extent that it won't be back again, or it'll just be minimized, so it's just not a problem anymore. Okay. So we talked about the need for strategies to employ when the old problematic behavior reoccurs, and behavior spikes are a very big reason that we do that. Eventually, a student can have their own crisis plan. So they know when they're getting to that point where they're going to blow up that, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to escape, I need to, whatever their need is, they need to fulfill that need internally to the best they can. Okay. Okay, so modifying the environment. And we've talked quite a bit about this, and this is for all students with behavior challenges. The classroom environment should be modified so that appropriate behaviors are encouraged. This, again, is very unique to each child. So we can have program modifications for, say, for Marie, who's tearing up her worksheets. One of the modifications we talked about is just not giving her worksheets for a while. Another one could be that the way that she's provided with the worksheet has changed, that she comes and picks it up at the teacher's desk, maybe to give her a little more control in the situation or whatever. So it can be simply a matter of how instructions are given. Even a tone of voice can make a big difference in modifying the environment. And again, this is as varied as the students that we help. But the main thing is that we want to get these students from having to be taught these externally or reminded them externally, to get them internalized as much as possible. Modifying an environment are those steps school staff take to help students succeed. They are not what the student does. These are exclusively the responsibility of the staff, not of the student or of the parent. So what we would like to have is that students being able to remind staff of what their modifications are, so that they're advocating for themselves, that they're practicing self-empowerment. And so the more that they can do that, the more that they can lead to independence and self-advocacy skills. So now again, it's another reason that we need to sit down with students and explain to them and remind them as time goes on exactly what's in the behavior plan and how it works, so that there's no surprises for anybody. For Robert, some modifications may include having his desk near the teacher, calling on Robert to answer a question without his raising his hand, as long as he knows the answer. So what the teacher might do before class is say, Robert, we're talking about, I don't know, I can't remember what they're reading in second grade, but we're talking about this book, and I want to make sure you know this answer, because I'm going to call on you and ask you what the answer to this is. So just expect me to call on you. That's a way for Robert to be able to anticipate, what's going to happen in class. It gives him control again of what's happening, and it satisfies that need for attention because he knows the teacher is going to call on him at some point. So for Marie, some modifications might include having a pre-designated break area, which we talked about, or a temporary pass on completing worksheets as she uses her stress reduction skills. Again, both of those we've talked about. We also talked about the fact that as these students become more skilled at using all these internal things, the more that their work production is going to increase. So first things first. That brings up something that is called fading. And we often talk about fading when we're talking about behavior plans. And what that means is, let's use the example of Marie with the worksheets. So at first, what we're doing is not having to do worksheets at all and simply practicing stress reduction techniques. And then what we're going to do is to fade that support to where she needs to be able to sit with having that worksheet in front of her on her desk, not do it, but continue to use her stress reduction techniques. And then we fade it to where she's writing her name beyond the worksheet and practicing the stress reduction techniques. And that you see what's going on with this. So what we're doing is that we're fading the supports and making more demands as her ability to accept those demands gets better. Okay, we're not going from 0 to her, getting 100% on a worksheet from the first, because that's just not possible to happen. We have to fade into that. All right. So for Tony, modifications may include the teacher. This is Tony who grits himself. The teacher may ask Tony to take a break if he is observed looking stressed before he acts out. Tony is allowed to choose what academic subject he would like to work on. So what we're doing is what Tony may choose to do is to work on an assignment about a skill that he already has acquired, instead of having him work on a skill that he hasn't acquired yet because he's feeling stressed. Now, what we can do is that we can switch those subjects around so that we're having Tony do the more stressful work at a time of the day that's the least stressful for him. So maybe he comes back after lunch and there's less stress then. That may be a time where we make the higher demands, but we don't want to insist that he do the things that are most stressful to him at a time when he's feeling the most stressed. Okay. For April, modifications can include never having food within sight at times other than regular meals or snack times, having predictable schedules for all meals and snacks, And we've talked about this, and making sure that the staff doesn't have their cups of coffee with them in school. We need to honor April's need not to have food present and to strictly control that. So, and for William, some modifications may include a choice board that lists classroom activities, pictures that he could choose from. However, the need to complete non-preferred tasks as well as preferred. Okay, so William is our student who needs the power and control. So we want to give him as much power and control as we can over his environment. But the demands are still there. We're not giving those demands away. We're not eliminating them. I do want to give you an example of, I think, my favorite. I don't know if this is a reinforcer or if this is a classroom modification. It doesn't matter. But I talked about my LA County Teacher of the Year, Vicki, who was my idol when it came to teachers. And she had a student with low functioning autism. And that student became very stressed when asked to do pretty much any kind of an academic assignment in class. And her stress would reveal itself by her yelling really loud in class. And I observed in the class a couple of times and witnessed this personally, and it was pretty intense. So what Vicki came up with, and I guess this would be a reinforcer, I don't know. Anyway, what Vicki came up with is that she made a deal with the student that during class breaks, she would go outside the classroom with the student in a private area, and she would allow that student to yell at her in her face for 30 seconds, as loud as she could yell. And I have to say that I don't remember the exact percentage decrease on it, but that behavior went down in the classroom 70 or 80% by just using that simple, pretty cool reinforcer classroom modification, whatever it might be. And it was quite good. So I like to share that one. Okay. So coping skills. And this is kind of what we've been dealing with all this time about talking, about what students need to learn to deal with these things. So teaching independence is critical to every child's special education program. In fact, it is, in my opinion, the most critical thing that we can teach. Having an independent, successful adult come out of a special ed system is the greatest gift that we can give to our children. They need to eventually have the skills to create and modify their own environments so that they are not relying on others to do so for them. And this is where fading comes into play. As coping skills increase, demands can be increased proportionally. And again, this is not a static process. This is something that we need to be very dynamic about and know that as things change, that we change the behavior plans to go along with them. Okay. So coping skill for Robert is that he learns that he is able to wait to speak out in a group situation. He learns to breathe deeply when he is feeling when the feeling to speak occurs. He learns to use self-talk to remind himself he will get his turn. So this is a life skill that Robert's going to use forever. Marie may always need strategies to tolerate or even escape stressful situations. So this is going to translate to life after school. So Marie needs to create a situation like a work situation, a living situation, where she can take breaks as she needs them, that she can escape things in a way that makes them look natural. So for instance, if she's in a meeting in an office, that she's able to use the restroom after the meeting to decompress for a few minutes, or she has a quiet place that she can go to decompress. So these needs don't go away. What we need to do is to be able to provide those skills so that our children can use them throughout the rest of their lives. Okay. So Tony has helped to create a living situation that allows him to avoid highly stressful demands. This is our student that hits himself. He keeps pictures of cars on his phone that he can look at when feeling frustrated, and knows looking at them helps. So Tony is learning, or will learn to advocate for himself for identifying stressful situations before they occur or before he becomes entangled with them, and to make sure that his life is as free as possible of those. He's going to have some of those situations, but he's going to learn those skills to help him deal with them. But if he can avoid those, that's what he's going to do. All right. So April learns that she can live semi-independently if she has a strict routine around food. She has a care worker that helps her at meal and snack times to monitor her diet. April learns how to advocate for herself. She knows that She has this condition. She's intimately aware of it. And so she knows that she has to have a certain environment that she has to live in. All right. So William, our student who needs the power and control. William learns how to ride a bus, walk safely in his neighborhood, and how to use money to buy what he wants at stores. He learns stress reduction techniques to use when he is frustrated by not being in charge of the situation. So what we're doing with William is that we're teaching him those life skills that allow him to take control of his environment and not the other way around. So if he can go into a store and buy his own groceries, he can go to a movie, he can do these things on his own. That gives him the greatest level of independence and will satisfy that need for power and control that he has. All right, so summing up, we learned about PBS theory and how children have a legitimate needs they have to communicate with their communicate through their behaviors. Second, we learned about the components. Let me go to the next slide there, Margaret. Okay. So we learned about the components of behavior intervention plans and how PBS theory fits in. And we learned that behavior intervention plans include the following provisions: the reasons for most behaviors, replacement behaviors, reinforcing the use of new behaviors, ignoring or minimizing old behaviors, what behavior spikes are, what environmental modifications are, and how we teach coping skills. Just to kind of a last little story on this, you can probably figure I'm a big believer in positive behavior support. And where I got that belief was when I was working with children with emotional disturbances, and I worked in a special school. It was a public school, but it was an isolated school. And we had 32 children in the school and 35 staff members that were working with the children. It was a very intensive program. But when I first got there, we were doing 2 to 3 physical restraints per week. And we were numerous times per week isolating children in what is called a cool down, basically an isolation room. And it became an untenable situation for everybody. So what we decided as a staff is that the 35 of us or so, that we were going to go take ourselves back to school. And we were going to really learn what positive behavior support was, about how to de-escalate crisis situations and how to be more respectful basically to ourselves and the children we were working with. So we went from that first year and a half when I was there, where we were doing all those restraints and isolations. I was there for 5 years. The last 2.5 years we were there, we did 1 restraint. And the number of isolations that we had children have to do was reduced. It was around 90%. So just by us becoming expert at what we were doing, we were able to help these children and not be able to honor them and not to, basically it's abuse, with not learning this stuff. So that's where my belief in this comes from. And I've never been disabused that it's any less effective than I thought at that time. So with that, that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.